This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Professor Mike Clarke is a founder of Evidence Aid and the director of the Hub for Trials Methodology Research at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland. For 25 years, Mike has focused his work on rigorous evaluations of the effects of a wide variety of health and social care interventions. He is passionate about improving access to reliable evidence for all decision makers, particularly in resource-poor settings. I spoke with Mike in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Where am I calling you today?
I'm sitting in my office in Belfast in Northern Ireland. Excellent. With the rain coming down around me.
I was just going to say...
Very typical day here.
I hope that you were enjoying some remnants of summer, but I guess not.
No, that's over.
All right. Mike, you work for Evidence Aid, or one of the focuses of your career is Evidence Aid. Tell us about what the genesis of Evidence Aid is. What does it do? What is its purpose? And how did you get involved with it?
The basic idea behind Evidence Aid is that people in the disaster context, whether they're planners or responders, they need access to good evidence. They need to know what works and what doesn't work. And in my regular job, that's what I'm about all the time. I'm trying to do research and trying to improve access to research that will help people in health and social care choose the interventions, actions, and strategies that are likely to be most beneficial. So I don't see it needing to be any different in the disaster context. And that was the inspiration really behind Evidence Aid 10 years ago when the Indian Ocean tsunami struck on December the 26th. And felt inside myself, well, what are we actually doing about this? I'm not a healthcare practitioner, so I'm not going to even dream of getting on a plane to go and try and help people. But I'm an evidence producer. So what am I doing to help when we've got this massive health, social care crisis developing around the coast of the Indian Ocean? So that got a group of us thinking, well, okay, so maybe we can identify the evidence that people would find useful. No possibility of doing that in the time frame for the tsunami, but a very strong sense that these things will happen again. So in healthcare, we've got rid of smallpox. Maybe we can get rid of polio. Maybe we can get rid of some other things, but we're not going to get rid of tsunamis and earthquakes and windstorms. So we know these things will happen again. How can we ensure that when they happen again, people have got access to the reliable information that will help them make a choice? So we're not about telling them what to do. Mm-hmm. We're about just saying, here's a piece of the jigsaw for your decisions and your choices.
Okay, so give me a concrete example that's come from the last 10 years of your work about what does work in a particular disaster situation. Like what kind of evidence would you, or palette of evidence would you put on, let's say, UNICEF, Medicine Sans Frontières, something like that you could offer them?
Sure. Well, you might be wondering, how do we manage all of these fractured limbs that we've got? Should we be giving people antibiotics before the surgery to minimize the risk of infection? What should we be doing in order to help children maybe cope with the grief? So these are the sorts of examples for which we would be trying to seek answers. And really, one of the very early examples, as Evidence Aid was forming, following the Indian Ocean tsunami, so Evidence Aid itself wasn't really up and running, but there's a systematic review bringing together the evidence on a procedure called brief debriefing, psychological brief debriefing. The concept is that people have been subject to a traumatic event, and the psychologists would go and talk to them about that event, maybe just for half an hour or so, with the idea being that will help them cope. And then you would move on. And in this situation of the tsunami, you might think, well, we'll move on to the next village and the next village and the next village. So at first sight, this sounds like an incredibly efficient intervention. The evidence is that it probably does not work. And there is some evidence that suggests it might actually be harmful. It might actually make the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, worse if it comes back at 6 or 12 months. And a colleague of ours called Pratap Tharian, who's a psychiatrist in India, was one of the people responsible for the psychiatric response to the tsunami on the southeast coast of India. And Pratap was aware of this evidence and said, whatever we do, we're not doing that.
Oh, very interesting.
So that's an example of where, with the best will in the world, they could have delivered an intervention that was useless or harmful. And even if something is useless, it has the downside that you've wasted time, you've wasted money. In a disaster context, you may have put people into the field that are just in the way and don't need to be there. And really bad, if it actually is harmful, your presence has made the situation worse. Not just your presence was a waste of time, but you've made it worse. So that's certainly a very early example of the sort of information that a review of the underpinning research evidence can give to decision makers, and that particular decision maker use that evidence to make a decision that they weren't going to deliver that intervention.
This sounds like a huge task. I mean, the different angles that you can look at a disaster and the interventions that are available are limitless. They're endless. How do you... Go ahead.
No, you're quite right. We probably expect that there will be hundreds, if not maybe 1,000, decisions that evidence could help with. So concrete, discrete decisions that the evidence might help with. So it is a massive task. The good thing is that many of these reviews have already been done in health and social care generally. And so what we're trying to do from an evidence aid perspective to begin with is say what reviews exist. Can we bring those together? And maybe there are 400 of those, maybe there are 600 of those. And can we show people how relevant they might be to disasters? There'll be then another tranche of reviews that we'll need doing that haven't been done. So it is a very big task, but it probably is manageable with enough volunteers and enough resources, because there are only so many decisions and choices that are likely to be needed. If we take regular healthcare, we would probably now estimate that we might need 20 or 30,000 reviews that would cover just about everything that you might decide in regular healthcare. Very rare conditions would add more. But if we think of the disaster context, there are many decisions and choices that people might need to make. Some about surgery, some about physiotherapy, some about drugs, then ones that are not health related. How do you build a safe area for children in a displaced person camp? What's the best way to keep dirty water away from a camp? What's the best way of using the sandbags is also an important question, as is what's the best way to treat people if they have got a bug from that dirty water.
And so evidence aid right now is the core thinking behind it, or the core research starts from the health and social welfare lens. Are there other lenses you're pursuing at the same time, or do you use that as basically your jumping off point to look at an entire disaster?
We certainly use that as the starting point. And one of the reasons for that is that reviews in health and social care, 20 years old at least now. I mean, they're older than that, but a big body of reviews has been built up over the last 2 decades. In other areas, there isn't that same volume. But we are hoping to look at those other areas. In the aftermath of a disaster, you might have questions about getting the schools working again, so education questions. You may have engineering questions, such as the best way to build the sandbags. Communication questions about how to share information that may not be anything to do with health, but the use of mobile phone technology, the use of the internet. These are all questions for which research evidence could help people making a decision. So we're beginning to stretch ourselves into those areas, but the dominant place for us to begin has been in health, simply because there is already this great reservoir of systematic reviews in health and social care that we can look into and pick out of that the ones that we think are disaster relevant.
You told us one story about the researcher in Kerala, I assume it's southern India. Is there a finding that you and your group have stumbled upon that you just absolutely floored you, as surprising, as completely unexpected, that you're now advocating for disaster response?
I would think that it is that one that I've just described. One of the challenges for reviews sometimes is that there's relatively little will completely shock you. And the reason being that we are reviewing the research that's already been done. So the idea behind the systematic review approach is to say there is a body of research out there. It's a bit messy. It's quite untidy. Can we bring it all together in one place so we now have clarity and a definitive answer? Now, when you're looking for exciting research to do, reviews are probably not the exciting research, because people might already know some of the answers. What the review does is say, here are all of the similar studies. This is the totality of the information. This is what you should be taking as the starting point for your decision about the effects of an intervention, action, or strategy. So we're sadly not at the end of research that says, wow, eureka moment. We're at the end of research that says, look, we've tidied it up for you. You do not need to go into the mess of the literature looking for the potentially relevant material. We've brought it all together into this review. We've summarized it, we've appraised it, and here is the final answer. And again, just to illustrate from healthcare, there are probably tens of millions of articles out there. There's a database, PubMed, which many people in healthcare would be familiar with, that has 23 million records in it. Inside those records, there will be a few that you might want to use for a very specific decision in health or social care. Finding those few in those 23 million is an enormous task. And what the review does is it says, someone else has already done that task. Here is the single answer. And so we're rarely we're excited by what we do, but we're rarely looking at the computer screen saying, wow, that's incredible.
Sure,
I wouldn't have thought.
You don't have the aha moment as much as you have here's the definitive.
Very occasionally, again, in other aspects of the reviewing I've done where we brought together really messy data, would we look at something and say, wow, that's new. No one's seen that. But most of the time, we're really saying, look, this is what you can believe. So we're really at sort of, I would see ourselves as at the end stage of research, where we say, okay, you've all done your studies. We're going to bring them together, and we're going to give you the clear answer from all of that research.
How do you
may have suspected that answer, and that's why the eureka moment rarely happens. People may have suspected it, but what we're doing is saying, we've proved it. Here is the definitive answer based on what's gone before. It's not your hunch or your assumption anymore. It is the robust collection of all of the relevant research.
This is important stuff. How do you get the word out and get this information into the decision makers' hands, or policymakers, or usually most of the time funding, funders' hands? And I'm thinking military. I'm thinking UN agencies, disaster response. These are complex organizations that are set in their ways. They have really smart people working for them. And here you are, sitting in Belfast saying, hey, we've got some pretty good answers. How you go about that, and what kind of success have you had?
Absolutely. I mean, it's an incredibly important point. So we could just sit and produce the material and hope people will find it. That's not a good strategy at all now for disseminating or knowledge transfer. So we're working with agencies, working with NGOs to say, look, we're here. This is what we can do to help you. And over the last few years, their feedback on what they need, how they need it, why they need it is really proving very helpful to us. So at the moment, most of the model is we're bringing the information together. We are raising awareness that this resource exists and encouraging people to come and use it. Our vision for the next year or two is to move to more of a push model, where we'd say, we know who actually needs certain elements of this information. Let's start pushing it to them. For example, if someone is responsible for the surgical response to a disaster, it's not much use pushing to them the mental health information. They need to have things around how do you manage fractures, how do you deal with someone who's lost blood, and also you're thinking about how to do this in a very chaotic context of a disaster setting. So moving to that push model and saying, here is the information. And we're fairly comfortable that the recipients of that want the information, because across many areas of our lives now, people are talking about evidence-based this and evidence-based that. So, evidence-based medicine's been around for a few decades. We now tend to talk about evidence-based healthcare, but you'll hear things about evidence-based education. So people are aware of the importance of evidence in decision-making. And that's certainly true in the disaster sector. And as you mentioned, donors and funders are getting increasingly keen on this, because they're beginning to say, how do we know that what we're giving you money for is likely to do more good than harm? Mm-hmm. So they're interested in how good were you last time at what you did, but they're really, really interested in how good will you be next time.
And more importantly, how effective will you be?
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. How effective, and that's making people think very hard about how do we measure effectiveness. Again, examples that we'll talk to people about just to illustrate is if you were supplying nutritional products in a disaster setting. So are you successful because the boxes of food arrived in the village? Are you successful if the food got into the children's bellies? Are you successful if the food, having got into the children's bellies, made them stronger and fitter? So making people think really hard about what they're trying to achieve, because their goal isn't to get boxes of food to villages, it's to get fitter and stronger children. And so thinking about that and so helping them to see what might be the most efficient nutritional strategies to be promoting, or what's the most efficient ways to get the nutritional products to the children who need them. So, there's a lot of thinking going on now that it's not just about getting the material to the village. It's about achieving the health or other outcomes that you are set up to make a difference on.
In my mind, this is pretty sexy work and has the potential to, as you said, give those definitive answers for disaster response. And who knows, there's a whole spectrum of other things. I know that you are part-time on Evidence Aid. Most of your staff are part-time. Can you tell me what that decision is? Is that purely a funding reason, or and is there a strategy for continuing to grow the organization or the effort to get the message out and be able to do these reviews in a more timely fashion?
Yeah, no, it's really important, and we're working on a shoestring at the moment. So at the moment, the staffing of Evidence Aid, and this sometimes surprises people when we say it, we have one half-time person called Claire Allen. Claire's the knowledge manager for Evidence Aid. She's based in Oxford. Bonix Kayebu works a day a week. Bonix is based in the Centre for Global Health in Trinity College in Dublin, and me, who is an academic who, under my academic post, has the ability to do things such as Evidence Aid. And then we have a part-time PhD student called Dominic Mellon, who's based in the UK as well. What we need are more people than that. And the limiting thing at the moment is just the resources. And we're in discussions with various potential funders of Evidence Aid, family foundations, and so on, to try and identify the resources that we need to get us up to the level that really can meet the need of the potential users. So at the moment, we're sort of ticking over, but we want to step this up a level. We want to get these hundreds of reviews all together in one place. We want them to have contextual information on them that will help decision makers see their relevance. We want to make sure that when you've got a few hundred reviews, if someone goes looking for something, they find their target. I mentioned PubMed and its 23 million things. It's clearly on a completely different scale. But it'd be no good me saying to a decision maker, here's a list of 500 reviews. They're in alphabetical order. Just look down it till you find what you're interested in. They're going to walk away from that. They need to be able to go to the database, do a search, and be given back the information. And we need to move to that push model of we look at the 500 reviews and we say that one, and that one, they need to be sent to those people who are planning the mental health response to major disasters. That one and that one, they need to go to people who are responsible for the dirty water that you may have following a flood, and whether that flood is because of the rain or because of a landslide or because of a windstorm. So we're very keen now to take us up another notch in order to actually deliver what we really want to see delivered, which is the ability for everybody involved in disasters to come to a place and find this collection of information which will help them make decisions. There's lots of other stuff they need in order to make a decision, but desperately you need to know how effective is that particular intervention. Because if it's not effective, then you're not going to consider it. If it's only slightly effective, you might be thinking about how much does it cost? Is it feasible? Is there an alternative? If it's really effective, you'd be thinking about how can we get that into the field? We're desperate. It's got to get into the field. And people need to know that effectiveness estimate, because there's a big difference between something that saves 1% of lives and something that will save 25 or 30% of lives. There's a big difference between something that will get people back to work in 3 weeks compared to 1 week, or compared to 6 weeks.
Forgive my presumptiveness, but this sounds like a great potential synergy with, some of the giant data warehousing and search organizations in the world. I'm thinking Google, Microsoft, Oracle, these kinds of things. Have you and your team gone down that path of raising your hand and say, hey, how could you help us do this? And sort of a second question there is, does it require a human? Do you think that it's important enough for a human to look at these and make that decision, or is this algorithmic that you could look through these, review them, and say, hey, here's the answer?
Yeah. We've had tentative approaches to some of those big data people, such as to suggest, and I think we're storing up a more serious approach to them for when we have got a substantial resource behind us. So if we've got the hundreds of reviews available, then what we certainly would want to be thinking about is how can we use the power of something like Google to help ensure that people find them. Some of the big data stuff, that's a step before what Evidence Aid would be doing, and we're trying to work with people into how they could actually do these reviews better by drawing more on the big data elements, and how they could draw better on research that's out there. A lot of thinking now in research about how to make the research more accessible, make it easier for people to do the reviews. Some conversations there. Then in relation to, could we just set a machine crawler on this and it would identify the relevant things? Again, there's thinking about that taking place across health and social care, but one of the challenges is that the human being processes information with a lot of other stuff that's in their brain. So they may see something as relevant as they're reading that sentence because they've got a lot of background contextual stuff in their brain. And my sense is the machines aren't clever enough for that. So we are working with experts to look at these reviews and say, okay, you've read that review. Tell us what it means for your colleagues in disasters, and tell us that in 100 words so that we can make that. And we're calling these contextual summaries, because a review may run to thousands of words. And a decision maker really doesn't want to read thousands of words. The thousands of words are there maybe to reassure them that the work has been done well, to give a variety of answers, because a variety of readers may come to that review, to set the scene for the review for the general reader. But many of those things are not of particular interest to a decision maker who's trying to decide which antibiotics should we send, what do we need to do about sick babies, how do we build that sandbag wall? They just want some very clear answers. So we're working with experts who've got brains full of information and contextual information. Say, okay, what does this review mean? And then give that 100-word summary to the decision makers. Some of them will say, well, I need to know a little bit more. I need to read the thousands of words. Some of whom will say, well, if that's what it's about, it's not relevant to me. And some of whom will take those 100 words and say, on the basis of that, we really should be doing this.
Beyond resource constraints, what's your biggest challenge? I know that you recently just had a symposium where you had a particular theme for that symposium. I'll let you explain that. But is it coming up against other academics who may disagree with your findings about the reviews? Is it getting to those decision makers? What's the biggest challenge?
I would say that the biggest challenge is the underlying research base for the reviews is usually fairly weak. So we can do a fantastic review, we can do a really thorough review, and we're looking through all of the information that there might exist across the world to bring it all together into the review. And we might end up at the end of the review saying, I can tell you very definitely that we don't know the answer. That's a bit sad.
Sure.
So for, what we clearly like to say is a very clear answer, but I might be able to simply say, I can tell you for sure that we don't know. That has value because it may burst the balloon of people who are saying, I can tell you for sure the stuff works. And we might be saying, well, on what basis are you telling us for sure it works? Because we've looked at the evidence base and that's not so clear. But more importantly, I think it can stimulate people to fill those gaps. It can stimulate people to say, actually, we really do need to know the best way to prevent cholera in this particular setting. And it's not really clear to us from the evidence what the best way is. There's a few alternatives. Maybe we could do a study to find the best way. And the really sad thing from a disaster perspective is, as I've already said, we're not going to stop them. There'll be more. But the upside of that is if people planned and delivered robust research in one disaster with all of the appropriate constraints on providing information to the participants and obtaining their consent and so on, those studies can be done. If it was done once, it would answer for next time, and we wouldn't go into next time uncertain. So I think a big challenge is the underlying research, because we have good methods to do reviews. We're developing better methods to disseminate the information from the reviews. But if the fundamental conclusion of the review is that we don't know, then there's not much a decision maker can do with that, other than they are definitely more informed than they were before. But it's not going to help them necessarily to make a choice between this strategy and that strategy.
My final question for you, Evidence Aid is presenting a service that has a potential value for thousands of people who might be listening to this. What's the best way for them to utilize the resource that you have? Is it through your website? Is it by contacting you? Is it through some other method?
Yeah, it's definitely from the website. So evidenceaid.org is the website, very simple URL. And they should go there and they should have a look and see what they can find. And that website is evolving, almost as we speak. We've been building it for a while now, but now we're really starting to layer the extra information in, to try and get the contextual summary in, to try and find more of the reviews to fill some of the gaps, to make it easier for people to search the website. So that's where they should go. And what I would really strongly encourage people to do is, if they go there and they don't find what they're looking for, tell us what we're missing. Tell us how to improve it. We're very open to constructive criticism of what we're doing in order to make it better. Because a point that's very important, whenever I stand up on a platform at a conference or I'm teaching, is to stress what I'm not. I'm not a healthcare practitioner. I'm not a disaster responder. I need the people who are those things to tell us what they need from us, because then we can do our research better and make it more useful. So I would encourage people to go to the website, find stuff there that is useful to them. But when they don't find things, to tell us what we're missing so that we can work together to actually improve it. Because the long-term goal of this is that the Evidence Aid website becomes the place that people go to get their answers. And we want it to be as useful as possible. We don't want people to go there, have a look around, and walk away from it unclear about what resources they might have identified.
Mike, thanks so much.
We want them to go there and find what they need.
Mike, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Stephen.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.